Welcome to The Culture Shift. We want this podcast to empower you as leaders to make impactful change in your workplace. I'm Vicki Baars, and I specialise in transforming organisations through equity, diversity and inclusion initiatives. In each episode, we'll delve deep into the fascinating world of workplace culture. Join me as I sit down with an array of incredible guests, including members of our very own Culture Shift team and industry experts. Through these thought-provoking conversations, we aim to equip you with the knowledge, tools, and inspiration you need to drive positive change in your workplace. Whether it's breaking down barriers, thinking about how you include a more diverse workforce, or fostering a culture of collaboration and belonging, we've got you covered. So let's dive straight into an episode. Hello and welcome back to The Culture Shift. Today, I'm so excited to be sitting down with Ash McDowell, our Director of Finance here at Culture Shift. Today, we're going to discuss building the business case for inclusion, but also looking beyond the financial cost to the business and towards the cost to the employee's emotional and physical well-being. Ash, before we get started, can you give me a brief bit of context as to your role and what it entails?
Sure, yeah. So I'm the finance director here at Culture Shift. I'm responsible for anything with a number that comes into the business, looking after the risk, understanding how the business is performing, and reporting out to our sort of key stakeholders to make sure that everybody is happy with the direction the business is going in, and we're performing to the best of our ability, really.
So we wanted to talk today about the cost to organisations when bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct takes place. There's obviously the hard figures, which you're very familiar with, and we'll go through some of those as we're having the conversation. But to set the tone for today's session, I think we also want to talk quite a lot about the cost to the employee's emotional and physical well-being. And, you know, there's a lot of research we've done as Culture Shift to kind of unravel some of that data and understand in a bit more depth.
Yeah, so we all know that in the workplace you spend 5 days a week speaking to your colleagues, being around people. You spend the majority of your waking time with your colleagues at work. And so it's really important that people feel comfortable in that environment. And if you're subjected to bullying or harassment in that situation, that can take such a toll on people's emotional well-being, on their mental health, because you rely on your job, and so you're kind of trapped, and there's very little you can do to escape that, and that does take such a massive toll on people. Yeah,
and I think the point you made there about like how much time you spend at work is really significant. It is probably, you know, after sleeping, what we do the most in our lives. Unfortunately, we still have a 5-day working week. I'm pro a 4-day working week, but we can have that conversation another time. But, you know, this isn't a small problem. Loads of people are experiencing this on a regular basis. Our research shows that 61% of people have experienced problematic workplace behaviour and have had to take a period of long-term leave. So, you know, thinking about the toll it takes on the individual, that's, you know, a lot of people not being at work.
Absolutely, and that has such an impact on productivity in the workplace to an employer. But if you look to probably the more important issue there in terms of the person, like that, in that moment where you're being bullied or harassed, that's an awful thing to go through. But actually, over half of those people said that incident stayed with them for like over 2 years. And so for something so probably trivial to the person that was on the other side of delivering that case of bullying, can have such an impact on someone's long-term life, their mental and physical health. And I just don't think people understand that long-term impact.
Yeah, and to crunch some of those big numbers as well, you know, £381,350 is the average payout received for a discrimination at work case. That's quite a substantial amount of money. And, you know, it's in organisations' interests to not lose that money as a result of discrimination cases, but it's also the moral imperative to make sure that people aren't going through that, because that's what that money's for, right? It's compensation for the damages that are caused. And we might think about those that language in like an insurance sort of context of like, you know, you had a car accident, you get compensated for your damages. You know, we fix cars. It's not as easy to fix people when they've had these experiences.
No, absolutely not. There's so much that goes into those figures, and you can't argue with that case, because the impact it can have on someone's life is ridiculous. And just from not training your staff properly, not having a proper way of catching incidents early enough to ensure that this problem doesn't escalate and leads to those hefty payouts. It's a lot of money for a business to swallow for an incident that could have easily been avoided.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's absolutely right that employees should be providing support to individuals when they do experience this. So the kinds of support that people could be providing are sort of therapy, and, you know, employee assistance programs are quite, you know, I think they're in most organisations. Not many don't have them. If I stand right on that. And, you know, the fees and cost of going through those particular sort of tribunals where those big payouts happen, those, you know, could be avoided by supporting the individual earlier on. Yeah,
absolutely. I look at a lot of things from a risk perspective. And when you're talking payouts of over £250,000 up to £400,000, the thought of paying £1,000 a year to provide those sort of systems, it's peanuts. And it is, like you said, it's kind of an insurance as it was, but actually it's putting your best foot forward and looking after your employees. You know, the distress might not have come from the workplace, and there's lots of knock-on effects that people suffering from an incident outside of the workplace can have an impact in their day-to-day work life. And so providing those systems covers you on all bases to make sure that you're looking after your people, who in turn will look after you if they feel looked after.
Absolutely. And we talked a lot with Chelsea on the last episode about psychological safety and building trust. And, you know, people have lives outside of work, and to acknowledge and recognise that and support them in that. I think the times are changing quite a bit on that. I think, like, it used to be that you could only come to workplace schemes with workplace problems. And now they're much more open. And, you know, benefits we have inside Culture Shift, for example, where we get, you know, a mortgage advice, which is like one of the most stressful things people do is buy a house, right? Like, those sorts of things are really useful and help people in their everyday lives.
Absolutely. Kind of a story, actually. When I first started at Culture Shift, my mum had a cycle accident, quite a severe one. She had a brain injury, which she has now recovered from. But it was obviously a very distressing moment in my life. It was she was touch and go at one point, and this was week one in a job where you're so keen to make that wonderful first impression. You don't want to be taking time off. And the support that I got from Culture Shift, and this wasn't any sort of system, it was just the feeling I got from the managers here. It was the understanding that I got that I needed to take time off. It instantly told me that I was in an environment where I was going to be supported. But separately to that, the EAP system that we do have in place does actually cover sort of direct family members. And so my mum has actually used that system a lot to help with her recovery. And so that just from week one just made me go, do you know what, I'm in an environment here that I'm going to flourish in, because no matter what life throws my way, there's that understanding to help me get through that. And there have been times where a work problem has come in that's required me to go like the extra mile to help solve it, and instantly I've gone, I don't mind doing this, because work went the extra mile for me when I needed it.
And it's about balance, isn't it?
Massively.
Yeah. So thinking about some of the other things we do in workplaces to support individuals' well-being, we have flexible working patterns, and those are exceptionally useful for individuals who you know, maybe from more diverse backgrounds. Like, I think a lot of the time, like, campaigns around flexible working came from working parents, like, you know, mothers returning to work primarily, but I think that's broadened now. And there's a lot of work in, like, gender equity to think about how, you know, fathers in particular are taking more time off with newborns, because we're still seeing that there is a big gap in people's employment records, and it's absolutely totally valid to take time off as a new mum, like absolutely please do if you want to, but what was noticing was it was habitual rather than choice, and so there's been really great policies been brought in, and I think we've got some really good examples at Culture Shift, but I think those sorts of workplace policies and practices really allow people to help sort of balance work life, which I think is what you kind of alluding to there.
Yeah, work-life balance is something that is really important to people. I think particularly since COVID. During COVID, we got used to working from home, to being able to sort of almost dial in and dial out as we were allowed to do during that time. That age of flexibility definitely sort of sprouted from there. And certainly for me, I changed my role. I moved to Culture Shift during the COVID pandemic, and I think back to the role I was in previously, where I was in an office Monday to Friday. I was arriving at 7:30. I probably wasn't leaving until 7:30, and it was just a completely different world. And the impact that had on my mental health was ridiculous. But now those flexible working patterns allow people to prioritize what's important to them and go, I'm still going to do my work. I'm still going to contribute in exactly the same way that I would. But that flexibility really, it lightens the load, knowing that you can make work revolve around your life rather than how it used to be, which was your life revolving around work.
Yeah, I absolutely feel those sort of long days in the office are well and truly gone, and they happen from time to time. You need to put that effort in on like particular occasions, but it feels great to me to work in an environment where it's not habitual, and that it is one-off. And I mean, I work mostly remotely, based in London, and the main head office is based in Manchester. And so when I travel up and I'm here, I might end up working a little bit later, but usually the office closes out like bang on 5 o'clock, and everyone goes home, and it's because people have got this wonderful work-life balance, and it's encouraged, and it's in just things like having people in the senior leadership team putting their childcare requirements like openly in their calendars, so as people can see what they're doing, like and that reason they're leaving the office and why they're going home. Not that you should have to justify it, but it sets a really good example.
Absolutely, and I make use of that. I've got a 1-year-old at home, and when I leave the office, I make sure I leave slightly earlier than I probably ordinarily would have done, so that I get that sort of golden hour before bedtime that I get to spend with my daughter. And then if I need to, I will log on afterwards to sort of finish off any work for the day. And I think that transparency, like you said, it shows to people that I can do this if I need to as well. It's leading from the top. It's practicing what you preach, and that flexibility can extend to cover all sorts of reasons. I mean, as an example, if you are of Islamic faith, when it comes to Ramadan and fasting and things like that, actually, that flexible working pattern can work really well to ensure that you're not working at a time where energy levels are starting to seep lower, and you can also be present and available when it's time to break fast. And so there's countless examples where flexible working hours can really sort of breed inclusive culture.
Yeah. I would love to bring into the conversation a couple of buzzwords we hear quite a lot on this topic, which is around sort of presenteeism and absenteeism, and sort of what's the difference and what they mean.
Sure. So absenteeism is probably the one that everybody is familiar with, and that is people not being in work, calling in sick, not turning up, which has a considerable cost, but it's easier to spot as a problem that when someone has missing days in their calendars that are perhaps unexplained or might not be the full truth behind the reason why they are off. Presenteeism is kind of a little harder to spot, because presenteeism is when people come into the office but aren't really there, they're not present, and therefore the productivity is super low. They might be bringing a quite negative attitude, which can provide a poor atmosphere in the workplace, and that can have a knock-on effect to other people as well. And it's a huge problem. In fact, Deloitte and the mental health charity Mind, their research said that it costs employers between 26 and 29 billion annually through lost productivity in the UK, and that's an astonishing number. And like I said, it's kind of harder to spot those trends because people are turning up.
Yeah, and I think, like, for me, presenteeism also is about sort of thinking about people's natural energy and workflows. It's as if there's loads of different parts to it, but I think, like, we were talking about flexible working, and that really feeds into it. But there's also the, like, if you're unhappy in your workplace, if you don't feel like you should be there, like there's something going on, whether it's bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct, or whether it's a discrimination case, or whether it's, because your workload doesn't match your skill set. Like, there's so many different reasons why you might not be happy in work. And yeah, just turning up day in, day out and not being able to engage with the work and not being able to kind of feel happy and enjoying it as well. Like, we are now in a time in history in the UK where work should be something that you enjoy and you feel proud to do, and you shouldn't have to just turn up and suffer it, basically. And that is kind of what presenteeism is, from what I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as humans, we operate best when we are happy and content and safe, and, all those very basic needs that we need.
Maslow's hierarchy, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. All those things that we need as people to thrive. And again, those issues might not be coming from the workplace, they might be coming from home, but it can be a distraction, and it has a knock-on effect. And also, high-performing teams work really well when everybody's firing on all cylinders. And so one issue affecting one person can have such a knock-on effect to their department or the entire organisation in terms of productivity and really making that team tick.
Yeah. And I guess, like, ultimately what happens if people are unhappy in the workplace is that we lose people, right? And the cost of recruiting is a huge dent in companies' kind of turnover and income. And some nationwide analysis reveals that on average it costs around £30,000 to recruit a new employee. Now, I think your figures suggest it might be more than that.
Yeah, so the very simple cost of recruiting someone, but being that through a recruitment agency, those numbers stack up very, very quickly. But there are other costs to take into effect when you're considering recruiting, and that is, loss of productivity. When someone's coming towards the end of their time in work, their productivity drops. When you bring in a new person, it takes time for them to get up to speed. And so there's a huge gap there where you're not getting the full-time employee equivalent of work out of people. There's also the cost of training. There's the cost of taking other people out of their roles to onboard and to bring people up to speed. And so my understanding is that it can cost anywhere between 50% to 200% of that person's salary to replace them. And if you're talking people higher up in your organisation commanding 60, 80, 100,000 pound a year salaries, that's potentially 200 grand it's costing to replace one person, albeit a high up senior person in your organisation. But that's a lot of money to sink just because you couldn't keep that first person happy and content in their role.
Yeah.
So in effect, when you're talking of costs, up to £200,000, it's much more cost effective to make sure you're providing a culture to retain your staff, to keep them happy, rather than just constantly churning new people, because that's such a drain on your time, but most importantly, your money.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with the concept of thinking about the business case for inclusion, it's really important that our workplaces reflect the types of people that we want to bring in. And we purposefully at Culture Shift hire for a culture add, not culture fit. That can make it uncomfortable sometimes, because someone may bring a diversity that the organisation doesn't know how to meet their expectations, and you have to go through a learning process, and that might be part of the retention process, is actually growing and learning and educating yourselves as a company to ensure that person can feel a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. People generally don't like change, and when you recruit for culture add, it means your culture is constantly changing.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge, because when someone has been with your business for a while and has gotten used to the way that things are, and then someone comes in, adds something to the culture, and suddenly not everything changes, but there's incremental changes, and then someone else comes in and there's another incremental change, it can suddenly feel very far removed from where they once were. Now, that overall effect should lead to a much more positive culture, but keeping your original team happy with that ever-evolving culture is a really difficult balance to find.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we do really well, and we already mentioned in the previous podcast, the shifter spotlights, which allow us to really get to know something about one another. But we've also got quite a comprehensive program of like equity and inclusion learning that we're going through. So we've done various different like lunch and learns mostly around different like types of diversity. So we've had ones on like neurodiversity, we've had ones on LGBTQ plus inclusion, and we've had ones on like bias. And I think, you know, these help with that continuous growth, continuous learning, continuous education. So I think the like broad stroke, this is a group of people, and like coupled with this is your individual and what their interest is or who they are, and, you know, telling you a bit about themselves. Like I think it's a really good partnership.
Oh, absolutely. In finance is such a transferable skill. So I'd never worked in a business like Culture Shift where all these things were important. And I've been here 3 years and I am such a more well-rounded person. Just because I'm exposed to all these different types of diverse people and cultures, and I'm being challenged to think about issues that I've never had to think about before. And I love learning about people and issues, and so I love the environment. I love that constant strive to educate, and it's been such an eye-opener for me. And I believe that there's lots of people that work here that have the same effect, and I would totally advocate for all businesses to give your staff the opportunity to talk about themselves on a wider basis, because that is such a big way of helping people understand each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm going to bring it to thinking a bit more about problematic workplace behaviours, because, you know, we're talking about some of the more positive things there, and I think, you know, bringing it back to the challenges that organisations face, you know, they can have a really substantial impact on the individuals, on the wider workplace culture, but also, I think, you know, from our perspective as a scale-up, like on investment and funding, right? And we aren't the only type of business that relies on investment and funding. And so, yeah, like what else, you know, what impact might that have?
So it's particularly at the moment, it is such a challenging environment for businesses that are seeking funding. There's, for the past almost 12 months, prices of things have been absolutely shooting up, and that affects everyone. Like, I think everyone can appreciate the cost of electricity bills that have gone up over the past 9 months. Food just seems to be absolutely skyrocketing, and that does impact everyone. And when you get into the world of investment, they are raising funds from someone who is also suffering these issues, and that becomes more difficult and more difficult. Now, in a challenging environment, when businesses are presenting their business case to the private equity or the venture capitalist firms that are out there, in this environment, they are looking for any excuse to drop you. And the minute they see something like a problematic workplace behaviour or issues with the culture in your team, that is such an easy issue to go, we don't want to go anywhere near that. Yeah. Because they know that later down the line that is going to come back to bite them. And
in fact, there's some data that backs that up. I think some research was done that says 86% of investors said that if they'd invested in a company that was embroiled in a workplace bullying harassment case, they would rapidly distance themselves from that company. It's quite a big statement.
It's a huge statement, but the investors are normally representing a portfolio of businesses, and like it or not, you are probably associated with the other businesses in that portfolio. So the minute that one has a workplace bullying problem in that portfolio, that reputation can go on to the investor, which can then be passed on to the other portfolio businesses. And so it makes perfect business sense to want to distance yourself from that, because that's not just your investment, but also the potential future growth of all the other businesses in that portfolio that could potentially be affected by that.
Yeah, that's big knock-on effects, doesn't it? And, another piece of information here is around sort of organisations hoping to secure investment. Almost 3/4 confirmed that they wouldn't invest in a company that had a problematic workplace culture. So that's preemptively looking at it. But also 2/3, so like 64%, wouldn't invest in a company that has numerous NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements, with former employees. Now, non-disclosure agreements are like quite a standard part of a settlement agreement. And so that's a really big percentage, and I think that the dial is shifting on how many people are using NDAs now to settle employment issues around sort of bullying, harassment, and especially sexual misconduct. There's been big campaigns around silencing victims of that experience, and so that's a really powerful statement from investors to say, actually, if you're racking up NDAs, there's probably a problem here.
It's huge, and if you think about it, the people in businesses are the experts on the culture and the goings on in that business. And it's maybe it's a crude example, but if you were buying a car, then you would want to speak to the experts to understand how that car has been looked after. And you wouldn't buy a car if someone says, no, actually, this car's been constantly driven at high speed. The tyres are absolutely burnt out because they've been razzed around corners. It's been driven into a ditch however many times. And so it's the same process. The investor is looking at you going, I don't want a business that has driven its employees into a ditch. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about company reputations and how easily they can be damaged. I think a lot of companies, are pride themselves on their reputation. They need it to perform the function they do or sell the product that they sell. And, these sorts of harassment, bullying cases can quickly, dissolve someone's good reputation.
Yeah, reputations are something that are damaged really easily. And the minute you get allegations of bullying and harassment in the workplace, it's going to have such an impact on a business on a number of fronts. I mean, we talked about investment before, but recruiting top talent, if you see in the news or there are websites now like Glassdoor where people will post reviews of their experiences in a workplace, the minute they see that there is the possibility that I'm going to be mistreated if I work in this business, that's going to just turn your head over to somewhere else.
I wonder how many young people are thinking about not applying to a particular food chain for their first jobs at the moment with what's going on in the news.
Yeah, absolutely. And universities as well. I think the upcoming generation are a lot more tuned in to these issues than we ever were. And I believe that when looking at universities, it's one of the things that they look for the most is the culture and the student happiness over necessarily the grades that university is generating. And that will, as they become the future workforce, that will translate into people wanting to move into the workplace. So it's so important that businesses aren't letting this affect their reputation.
Yeah, and graduate expectations have been driving workplace expectations for so long. Like, I think, it happens generation on generation, and we are seeing, an information kind of transformation, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, people have so much information, like you say, like Glassdoor at their fingertips to help them make decisions about where they might want to work and who they want to work with and what sort of environment they want to be in. It's so common to find workplaces where there are difficult experiences going on, and more they're getting shared publicly.
Absolutely. I remember when I took one of my first jobs that a big draw of working there was they had a pool table. But I don't think that's the case anymore. That's not the draw. It's not. It's certainly not enough. A pool table's lovely. But if you get to play pool while someone is harassing you in the background, then that's not a nice place to be in. If I'm going to be treated well, but I don't get to play pool, I have to wait till after hours to do that, then that is the choice that I and many other people are going to make.
Absolutely. So ultimately, we're talking about the fact that workplaces need to invest in being somewhere where people can feel safe and included in order to succeed, right? We're talking about the fact that we want to make workplaces where people feel they want to not just show up, but contribute effectively. And that is, the antithesis of absenteeism and presenteeism, which we talked about. We really want to ensure that people, if they're feeling burnt out, have an option of what they could do.
Yeah, so one of the things we offer at Culture Shift are wellbeing days. And I took a wellbeing day recently. I felt like I was wading through treacle at the start of the week. It got to Wednesday morning and I realised that I probably hadn't done as much work as I would have expected myself to do Monday, Tuesday. I couldn't really put my finger on what it was that was affecting me. I just knew something was. And so I took the decision that I was going to take a wellbeing day on the Wednesday just to get my head right. I went for a walk in the sunshine. I played a computer game. I think I ate some junk food. Perhaps not the picture of absolute health, but it did the trick. Yeah. And when I came back in on the Thursday, I was motivated and ready to go, and I probably did more work in those 2 days than I would have done the rest of the week had I just kept ploughing on and trying to get through that. And part of that was the fact that I knew that I wouldn't be judged for taking that well-being day. I think sometimes there's a stigma. There is a stigma attached to mental health, and that's not always seen as a genuine reason to take time off work. But actually, when we come back to what we were talking about before about presenteeism and productivity, if you're not taking these things seriously and you're not providing someone with a safe space to go, do you know what, I need some time just look after me today, then you're going to end up in a situation where productivity absolutely falls flat, where presenteeism is absolutely sky high, and you've got a non-motivated workforce who aren't producing great results, which ultimately is going to affect your bottom line because you're not getting as much out of them, the work they're doing isn't very good, and therefore that's going to lead to higher costs and lower sales and just a failing business.
Yeah, and I think another thing I'd like to sort of bring into the mix today is around like hiring a diverse workforce and keeping a diverse workforce. We've talked a bit about the cost of replacing people, and we've talked a bit about being able to bring their whole selves to work in the sense of showcasing who you are and your interests through our Shift to Spotlight kind of sessions. But there's also loads of data out there, and I haven't got any of it to my fingertips, but that shows that a more diverse workforce is a more successful one. It brings diversity of thought, it brings innovation, and it brings in the capacity to learn from one another and to really do things differently. Because if you just have a homogenous workplace where everyone thinks the same and works the same, you're going to stagnate. Absolutely.
Businesses are getting much better at hiring diverse, but the real challenge is keeping a diverse workforce, because you've got to provide that culture, that inclusivity that means that they feel supported and happy and safe in their workplace. And that diverse workforce is going to unlock so many key things in your decision making. There are very, very few businesses out there where the end user isn't diverse, and therefore how can you possibly say that you are providing the best possible solution to whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve if you're not taking all the viewpoints from everyone who could possibly benefit from your solution? So you need that diverse thought, you need the creative ideas coming from all areas to fully make sure that your solution is an all-encompassing one.
And that works for whatever kind of workforce you are, right?
Absolutely.
Like whether that is a public sector providing services, whether that is, in the tech industry providing products, whether that is in the finance industry making profit, it applies to everyone, right?
Absolutely. And if you're only going after a majority group, you're still alienating all those minorities, which when added up are a considerable amount of people.
I would say the majority.
Exactly.
There's a reason actually that a lot of people of colour use the term around global majority, because it's a fact that perhaps they might be from a minoritized group within the UK, but actually we don't live in a world where borders are that much of a barrier. We all work remotely. Loads of companies are global, and it actually we don't stop at our own borders these days when it comes to business interactions. We are actually, like I say, a global entity a lot of the time, and so actually you might not be dealing with a majority white country, for example, when you're doing your business. So to have a majority white staff might really disadvantage you in dealing with people when you're working internationally.
Absolutely. And almost to go back to the pure finances, if you want to really capture that full-on market share, if you want to go after everyone that is out there, you need to be considering every single aspect and appealing to all. It's as simple as that.
Thank you so much, Ash. This has been a really interesting conversation. We've covered so much. We've talked about, thinking beyond the financial cost to the business of not having inclusion, what it costs to employees' emotional and physical well-being. We've talked a bit about the need to prioritise inclusion and why, and the benefits that can bring to your company. We've talked about presenteeism and absenteeism and the difference between the two and the impact that can have on your bottom line, but also on the individual's sense of self. And we've also talked a bit about the big cost of sort of employment tribunals, and then some of the more everyday things that we can be doing, like flexible working patterns and taking wellbeing days.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. I've loved every second.
Thanks. Thank you for tuning into this episode of The Culture Shift. We hope you found it insightful and informative. We really appreciate your support and value your feedback. So if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share your thoughts, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated on when we release new episodes. If you're interested in our other content or how Culture Shift can help your organisation, check out our YouTube channel, website, or drop us a message, and I'll see you next time.